The moment you decide someone is beneath you, you may be standing in front of the person who can change your entire future. Margaret Sinclair had no idea how true those words were as she stepped into first class on Flight 728 from New York to Dallas on a bright Monday morning. Dressed in a cream designer suit and carrying a handbag that cost more than most people's monthly rent, Margaret moved confidently down the aisle, barely acknowledging the flight attendants greeting her by name. As CEO of Sinclair Retail Group, she was used to special treatment, and she expected it everywhere she went. She stopped beside seat 2A, smiled briefly, then froze. Sitting in seat 2B was a well-dressed black man in his late 40s, calmly reading a financial newspaper while a young girl around 10 years old sat across the aisle beside him, quietly sketching in a notebook. The man looked up with a polite smile. "Good morning," he said warmly. Margaret did not return the smile. Instead, she looked at her boarding pass again as if hoping she had made a mistake. "Excuse me," she said sharply, flagging down a flight attendant. "There must be some kind of error." The attendant approached. "Is there a problem, Miss Sinclair?" Margaret lowered her voice, though not enough to prevent nearby passengers from hearing. "Yes, I would like another seat. Unfortunately, first class is completely full today," the attendant explained kindly. Margaret glanced toward the man beside her and frowned. "Then perhaps someone else can be moved." The attendant looked confused. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but everyone is already assigned." Margaret sighed dramatically. "I spend hundreds of thousands of dollars with this airline every year. I shouldn't be forced into an uncomfortable situation." Several passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The man beside her simply folded his newspaper and remained silent. The young girl looked down at her sketchbook. The attendant maintained her professionalism. "Sir, would you be willing to switch if another seat becomes available?" she asked gently. "Of course," the man replied calmly. "I don't want anyone inconvenienced." His composure seemed only to irritate Margaret further. "Honestly," she muttered loudly, "customer service isn't what it used to be." An older veteran seated across the aisle stared directly at Margaret, clearly unimpressed. A young couple in the second row stopped their conversation entirely. The atmosphere in the cabin changed instantly. Yet the man beside Margaret extended his hand politely. "I'm Marcus Johnson," he said. Margaret ignored the gesture, placed her bag forcefully in the overhead bin, and sat down without a word. As boarding continued, no one realized that within the next 24 hours, nearly everything Margaret valued, her reputation, her business future, and her sense of control, would begin slipping away. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, the tension in first class remained impossible to ignore. Margaret crossed her arms and stared straight ahead, clearly determined not to acknowledge Marcus or the young girl across the aisle. The girl occasionally looked toward Marcus with a gentle smile, and each time he returned it with the calm reassurance of a caring parent. About 20 minutes into the flight, beverage service began. The flight attendant, still maintaining her professionalism despite the earlier incident, stopped beside Marcus first. "Mr. Johnson, would you like your usual sparkling water?" she asked. Marcus smiled. "Yes, thank you, Rachel." Margaret immediately turned toward the attendant. "You know him?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. Rachel nodded politely. "Mr. Johnson flies with us fairly often." Margaret let out a quiet scoff. "Interesting." Marcus simply thanked Rachel and opened his newspaper again. A few minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard and mentioning that weather conditions over Texas were expected to be excellent. Most passengers relaxed, but Margaret appeared increasingly irritated by Marcus's calm demeanor. Finally, she leaned toward him slightly. "Business or pleasure?" she asked, although her tone sounded more like an interrogation than conversation. Marcus lowered his newspaper. "A little of both," he answered pleasantly. "I have an important meeting this afternoon." Margaret nodded smugly. "So do I. My company is finalizing a major partnership. It is probably the biggest deal of the year." Marcus smiled politely. "Congratulations. Those opportunities can change a company." "Trust me," Margaret said confidently. I know exactly how business works. Before Marcus could respond, the young girl across the aisle spoke softly. Dad, can you help me with this drawing? The word caught Margaret's attention immediately. She glanced at the child for the first time. The girl held up a sketch of an office building surrounded by children and trees. It looks wonderful, Sophie, Marcus said warmly. Remember to add the community center in the corner. Sophie nodded enthusiastically and returned to drawing. Margaret watched silently for a moment before turning away. An hour later, while many passengers slept, Marcus received a phone call through the aircraft's approved communication system after the plane reached cruising altitude. He spoke quietly, but several nearby passengers could not help overhearing fragments. Yes, the board presentation is ready. No, I want the scholarship initiative included. We can discuss the acquisition this afternoon. Absolutely, the final decision will be mine. Margaret pretended not to listen, yet her expression subtly changed. The older veteran across the aisle noticed. He had observed Margaret since boarding, and now he seemed increasingly curious about Marcus himself. Shortly afterward, Sophie accidentally dropped her colored pencils into the aisle. Before Marcus could stand, the veteran bent down and gathered them. You are quite an artist, he told Sophie kindly. Thank you, sir, she replied with a bright smile. My dad says art helps people understand each other. The veteran glanced knowingly toward Margaret before returning to his seat. For the first time since boarding, Margaret looked uncomfortable, although she could not explain why. She still believed she knew exactly who Marcus Johnson was, and she had no idea how wrong she was. The remainder of the flight passed quietly, but beneath the silence, something had shifted. Margaret could feel it even if she refused to admit it. Marcus continued treating everyone around him with effortless kindness. He thanked the flight attendants by name, asked Sophie about her drawing project, and even spent several minutes speaking with the elderly veteran across the aisle about military service and community volunteer work. The conversation was warm and genuine, and before long, several nearby passengers had joined in. Margaret remained isolated in her seat, occasionally checking emails on her tablet. At one point, she received a message from her executive assistant marked urgent. The subject line read, Final confirmation. Hawthorne Capital meeting at 3 p.m. Margaret smiled immediately. Hawthorne Capital had spent months evaluating Sinclair Retail Group, and today's meeting could secure a desperately needed investment package worth nearly $200 million. Without that deal, her company would face serious financial challenges within the next 6 months. Margaret had built her career on confidence, determination, and an unwavering belief that she could control every outcome. She had no intention of allowing anything to jeopardize this opportunity. As she reviewed the presentation materials, Sophie suddenly leaned across the aisle. Excuse me, ma'am, she said politely. You dropped your pen. Margaret looked down and saw the expensive silver pen beside her shoe. Sophie handed it to her with a friendly smile. Thank you, Margaret replied automatically before quickly returning her attention to the tablet. Sophie quietly resumed coloring. The veteran watched the exchange carefully. After several minutes, he leaned toward Margaret. You know, he said softly, that little girl seems awfully kind. Margaret barely looked up. I suppose. The veteran nodded. Kindness usually reflects good parenting. Margaret offered no response. A short time later, turbulence caused the aircraft to shake gently. Several passengers looked uneasy, including Sophie, who instinctively reached for Marcus's hand. Marcus reassured her immediately. Everything is fine, sweetheart. Just a little rough air. His calm voice seemed to relax not only Sophie but also several nearby passengers. Even Rachel, the flight attendant, smiled appreciatively. Once the turbulence passed, Marcus excused himself and stepped toward the front galley to take another call. This time, Margaret could not help overhearing more of the conversation as he passed. Yes, make sure every board member receives the revised proposal before the meeting. No, I have not made my final decision yet. Character matters as much as numbers. If leadership does not align with our values, we walk away. Margaret frowned. The words seemed oddly familiar. Character matters as much as numbers. She had heard a similar phrase during preliminary discussions with Hawthorne Capital months earlier. Before she could think further, Marcus returned to his seat. As the captain announced the initial descent into Dallas, passengers began gathering their belongings. Margaret glanced toward Marcus one final time. For reasons she could not explain, she suddenly felt uneasy. Yet she quickly dismissed the feeling. In less than 3 hours, she would close the biggest deal of her career. Nothing was going to stand in her way, or so she believed. After landing, the passengers slowly filed off the aircraft. Margaret remained seated for a moment, impatiently checking her phone as a stream of new messages arrived from her executive team. The latest message from her assistant, Lauren, immediately caught her attention. Reminder: Hawthorne Capital meeting moved to 2:30 p.m. at the Grand Meridian Hotel. Entire board expected to attend. This is critical. Margaret smiled confidently. Everything was still on track. She stepped into the aisle, expecting to leave quickly, but noticed an unusual scene unfolding just beyond the aircraft door. Several airport executives, accompanied by 2 security personnel in dark suits, were waiting near the jet bridge entrance. Margaret instinctively assumed they were there for a celebrity or a government official. As she approached, one of the executives walked directly past her. "Mr. Johnson," he said warmly, extending his hand toward Marcus. "Welcome back to Dallas. Your car is ready." Margaret stopped walking. Marcus shook the man's hand politely. "Thank you, Daniel. I appreciate you arranging transportation for Sophie as well." Sophie happily joined Marcus, still carrying her sketchbook. Another executive greeted the young girl enthusiastically. "Sophie, everyone at the foundation is excited to see your presentation tomorrow." Sophie smiled shyly. "I am excited too." Margaret stared in disbelief as the small group escorted Marcus and Sophie toward a private exit. Rachel, the flight attendant, happened to pass nearby. Unable to control her curiosity any longer, Margaret asked, "Who exactly is that man?" Rachel hesitated professionally. "I am sorry, Ms. Sinclair. I cannot discuss passenger information." However, the veteran who had shared the flight overheard the question. He smiled gently. "Sometimes it is better to learn who people are before judging them." Margaret forced an awkward smile and continued toward baggage claim. Outside the terminal, her driver was already waiting. During the 30-minute ride to the Grand Meridian Hotel, Margaret reviewed her presentation once again. Sinclair Retail Group had expanded aggressively over the past 5 years, but declining sales and increasing debt had placed enormous pressure on the company. Hawthorne Capital represented more than investment money. They represented survival. Without this deal, layoffs, store closures, and possibly bankruptcy could become unavoidable. When Margaret arrived at the hotel shortly after noon, she was surprised to find several board members already gathered in the executive lounge. Their expressions seemed unusually tense. "What is going on?" Margaret asked. Her chief financial officer looked concerned. Apparently, Hawthorne Capital changed the agenda this morning. They requested a private executive session before negotiations begin. Margaret frowned. "That is unusual." "There is more," another board member added quietly. "Their lead decision-maker personally requested this meeting. From what we understand, if this individual approves us, the deal moves forward immediately. If not, everything ends today." Margaret nodded confidently. "Then we simply impress whoever they send." But as she entered the conference suite and noticed a framed welcome display that read, "Welcome Hawthorne Capital Chairman Marcus Johnson," the color immediately drained from her face. Margaret stood motionless in the conference suite doorway, staring at the welcome display as if it might suddenly change. Marcus Johnson, Hawthorne Capital Chairman. The words repeated in her mind over and over. Could not be the same man. Simply could not. Yet deep down, she already knew the truth. The calm passenger she had dismissed, avoided, and quietly insulted only hours earlier was now the single most important person in her professional life. "Margaret, are you all right?" her chief financial officer asked. She quickly regained her composure. "Of course," she said, forcing a smile. "I am just surprised. I did not realize Marcus Johnson was leading negotiations personally. Several board members exchanged looks. Neither did we, one director admitted. Apparently, he rarely attends these meetings himself. Margaret immediately straightened her jacket and reviewed her notes again. She had spent decades building relationships and closing difficult deals. Surely one unpleasant interaction on an airplane would not affect a transaction worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Business was business. At precisely 2:30 in the afternoon, the conference room doors opened. Hawthorne Capital executives entered first, followed by legal advisors and analysts. Then Marcus walked in. He was dressed in a navy suit and carried himself with the same quiet confidence Margaret had witnessed on the plane. Sophie was not with him. Marcus greeted everyone individually, shaking hands and thanking each person for attending. When he reached Margaret, there was a brief moment of silence. "Ms. Sinclair," he said politely, extending his hand. Margaret hesitated for less than a second before accepting it. "Mr. Johnson, it is good to see you again." "Likewise," Marcus replied calmly. There was no hostility in his voice, no sarcasm, no indication that he intended to embarrass her. Somehow that unsettled Margaret even more. Once everyone was seated, Marcus began the meeting. Before discussing financial projections, Hawthorne Capital would like to review leadership culture and long-term organizational values. "We believe sustainable growth depends on more than revenue." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. During the next hour, Marcus asked detailed questions about employee retention, diversity initiatives, community engagement, and corporate ethics. Several Sinclair executives struggled to answer. Others admitted that certain programs had been reduced due to budget concerns. Margaret attempted to redirect the discussion toward profits and expansion plans, but Marcus gently returned the conversation to values. "Financial performance matters," he said. "However, character and culture determine whether success lasts." Again, Margaret recognized the exact phrase she had overheard on the aircraft. For the first time in years, she felt completely unprepared. As the meeting paused for a short break, one of Hawthorne Capital's senior analysts approached Marcus privately and handed him a tablet. Marcus reviewed something on the screen, his expression changing slightly. He looked across the room toward Margaret, then quietly nodded. Margaret noticed the exchange immediately. She had no idea what was on that tablet, but an uneasy feeling told her that the consequences of her behavior on the flight were only beginning. The 15-minute break felt longer to Margaret than the entire flight from New York. She remained seated while the other executives stepped into the lounge for coffee and private conversations. Across the room, Marcus stood near the windows overlooking downtown Dallas, speaking quietly with several members of his team. He appeared completely at ease. Margaret, on the other hand, could not stop replaying every moment from the plane. The ignored handshake, the complaints, the cold remarks, the uncomfortable looks from other passengers. For the first time in years, she found herself questioning her own judgment. Her assistant Lauren hurried into the room carrying a folder. "Margaret, there is something you need to see," she whispered nervously. Margaret accepted the folder. Inside was a briefing packet prepared by Hawthorne Capital's research division. One page immediately caught her attention. It featured a photograph of Marcus standing beside former presidents, business leaders, and charitable organizations. Another page detailed Hawthorne Capital's mission statement: investing in companies that demonstrate integrity, inclusion, and community leadership. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. She turned another page and froze. There was a section highlighting the company's annual children's education initiative. The photograph showed Marcus and Sophie together at the opening of a nationwide scholarship program. The caption read, "Marcus Johnson and his adopted daughter Sophie Johnson announce a $100 million educational investment benefiting underserved communities." Margaret stared at the picture. Sophie, the little girl she had barely acknowledged on the plane. The same child who had kindly returned her pen. "Why was I not given this information earlier?" Margaret asked quietly. Lauren looked surprised. "Everyone in corporate finance knows who Marcus Johnson is. He is one of the most respected investors in the country." Before Margaret could respond, She received a text message from a member of her public relations team. The message contained a link with only 3 words. "You need this." Margaret opened the link and immediately felt her stomach drop. Someone on the flight had recorded part of the confrontation during boarding. The short video had already been uploaded to social media. Although it did not capture everything that had happened, it clearly showed Margaret requesting another seat and complaining loudly about being placed beside Marcus. Thousands of comments had already appeared beneath the video. Some criticized her behavior. Others praised Marcus for remaining calm and respectful. The video was spreading rapidly. Margaret quickly locked her phone screen as Marcus and the Hawthorne executives returned to the conference room. The second session began promptly. This time, Marcus addressed the entire Sinclair leadership team directly. "At Hawthorne Capital, we evaluate more than financial statements," he said. "We invest in people. Leadership decisions shape employees, customers, and communities. Therefore, understanding character is essential." His words were calm and professional, but Margaret could not ignore the growing sense that the room itself had changed. Then Marcus looked directly at her. "Ms. Sinclair, could you describe the values that guide your leadership when no one important is watching?" For several seconds, Margaret could not answer. The room became so quiet that Margaret could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Every executive around the table turned toward her, waiting for an answer. Margaret had spent years speaking confidently in front of investors, analysts, and shareholders. Yet Marcus's question unsettled her in a way no financial challenge ever had. She cleared her throat. "I believe strong leadership requires discipline, accountability, and delivering results," she said carefully. Marcus nodded politely. "Those qualities certainly matter," he replied. "But I asked about values. Specifically, how leaders treat people when there is no obvious benefit to doing so." Margaret hesitated again. Before she could answer, Marcus continued. "At Hawthorne Capital, we have learned that character often reveals itself during ordinary moments. In airports, restaurants, meetings, flights, small interactions frequently tell us more than formal presentations ever can." Several members of the Sinclair board shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Margaret felt her face grow warm. She knew exactly what Marcus was referring to, yet he still had not mentioned the plane directly. Instead, he had chosen professionalism over embarrassment. Somehow, that made the situation even more painful. Marcus looked around the room. "For this reason, Hawthorne Capital conducts extensive leadership evaluations before finalizing any investment." One of Sinclair's board members quickly interjected. "Mr. Johnson, Sinclair Retail has consistently delivered strong quarterly performance. We believe our numbers speak for themselves." Marcus smiled respectfully. "Numbers tell an important story, but people write that story. Companies with healthy cultures outperform those without them over time." He then activated the presentation screen. A series of slides appeared showing employee turnover rates, customer satisfaction trends, and internal survey results from Sinclair Retail Group. Several metrics were significantly below industry averages. Margaret stared at the screen in disbelief. "Where did you obtain this information?" she asked. "From your employees," Marcus answered calmly. "More than 600 current and former employees voluntarily participated in confidential interviews during our due diligence process." The room fell silent once again. Marcus continued. "Many employees described Sinclair Retail as highly demanding, but several also expressed concerns regarding workplace culture, communication, and respect." Margaret immediately attempted to defend herself. "Running a successful company requires difficult decisions. Not everyone appreciates high standards." Marcus nodded. "That may be true. However, there is a difference between demanding excellence and failing to recognize the dignity of others." Those words struck Margaret harder than any public criticism could have. At that moment, the conference room door opened quietly. Sophie entered alongside 2 foundation representatives. She carried the same sketchbook she had brought on the flight. Marcus smiled warmly. "Everyone, I would like you to meet Sophie Johnson. Sophie serves on the advisory council for our educational foundation." Several executives greeted her politely. Sophie smiled and waved. Then she noticed Margaret and offered the same kind expression she had shown on the plane. "Hello again, Miss Sinclair," she said warmly. Margaret forced a smile, overwhelmed by guilt. Marcus looked toward Sophie. "Would you like to share your project?" Sophie opened her sketchbook and revealed a drawing of a future community learning center. At the bottom of the page, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "Every person deserves kindness because you never know what they are carrying." Margaret lowered her eyes. For the first time, she realized that this meeting was no longer simply about saving her company. It had become something far more personal. Sophie carefully placed her sketchbook on the conference table, and for a moment, the atmosphere in the room softened. Several Sinclair executives complimented her artwork, genuinely impressed by the detailed drawing of classrooms, playgrounds, and community spaces. Sophie smiled modestly. "The center is designed for children who do not always have access to good schools or after-school programs," she explained. "My dad says that opportunity changes lives." Marcus looked proudly at his daughter. "Sophie has helped review every major educational project our foundation has supported during the past 2 years," he said. One Sinclair board member looked surprised. "That is remarkable for someone so young." Sophie shrugged innocently. "I just try to think about what kids need." Margaret listened quietly, feeling increasingly ashamed. Earlier that same day, she had viewed Sophie as little more than an inconvenience on a flight. Now she was discovering that the child had already helped shape programs benefiting thousands of families across the country. One of Hawthorne Capital's executives then displayed a new presentation on the screen. "There is one additional opportunity we had hoped to discuss today," she announced. "Our foundation intends to launch a national education initiative valued at nearly $100 million over the next 5 years. We originally identified Sinclair Retail Group as a potential strategic partner because of its nationwide footprint." Several Sinclair board members immediately brightened. The opportunity represented not only significant revenue but also a chance to rebuild the company's public image. Margaret felt a surge of hope. Perhaps the situation could still be salvaged. The executive continued. "This initiative would include learning centers inside selected retail locations, scholarship programs, and community outreach services." Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "I was really excited about it," she said. "I even made drawings for what some of the centers could look like." She opened her sketchbook again, revealing multiple colorful designs featuring Sinclair stores transformed into welcoming educational spaces. Several executives smiled. Then Sophie's expression changed slightly. "But after today, I am not sure anymore." The room immediately grew quiet. Sophie looked toward Marcus uncertainly. Marcus spoke gently. "Sophie, you are always encouraged to speak honestly." Sophie nodded. "I know businesses have to make money," she said softly. "But if a company is going to help children, the people leading it should care about people too." No one spoke. Margaret felt every eye in the room shift toward her. Marcus remained composed. "At Hawthorne Capital, we believe partnerships require shared values," he said calmly. "Financial returns matter, but trust matters more." Just then, Margaret's phone vibrated repeatedly. She glanced down and saw dozens of notifications. The video from the airplane had exploded online. Major business reporters had already begun sharing it. One headline immediately caught her attention. "CEO accused of disrespectful conduct during flight." Her public relations director had sent an urgent message. "Call immediately. Crisis developing." Margaret slowly lowered the phone. Less than 8 hours earlier, she had boarded a plane believing she controlled her future. Now, sitting across from Marcus and Sophie, she realized that everything she had worked for was beginning to unravel, and the consequences were spreading far beyond a single failed interaction on an airplane. Margaret excused herself from the conference room during the next break and walked quickly into a private hallway. The moment the door closed behind her, she called her public relations director. "Tell me exactly what is happening," she demanded. The response was immediate. "It is bad, Margaret. Very bad. The video has already been viewed more than 2 million times. Several major business journalists are covering the story, and social media users have identified you as the chief executive officer of Sinclair Retail Group. Margaret leaned against the wall. What are they saying? There was a brief pause. People are questioning your leadership and company culture. Former employees are beginning to share negative experiences online. We are receiving calls from reporters every few minutes. Margaret closed her eyes. Issue a statement immediately. We can, the director replied carefully, but I strongly recommend that it include a sincere apology. Margaret ended the call without responding. For years, she had believed that success insulated people from consequences. Now she was discovering that public trust could disappear in a matter of hours. When she returned to the conference room, she found Marcus speaking privately with several Hawthorne board members while Sophie sat nearby, quietly drawing again. Margaret walked toward Marcus. Mr. Johnson, may I speak with you for a moment? Marcus nodded and stepped aside with her. For the first time since meeting him, Margaret struggled to find the right words. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. My behavior this morning was inappropriate. Marcus listened respectfully but said nothing. Margaret continued. I made assumptions that I should not have made. I am sorry. Marcus remained calm. I appreciate you saying that, he replied. Apologies matter. Margaret felt a small sense of relief. Then Marcus added gently, but meaningful change matters even more. His words were not cruel. They were honest. Before Margaret could respond, the meeting resumed. The final agenda item involved Hawthorne Capital's investment decision. Every person in the room understood the importance of what would happen next. Marcus stood at the head of the table. After completing our financial review, operational analysis, and leadership assessment, Hawthorne Capital has reached a decision. The room became completely silent. Marcus continued. Sinclair Retail possesses significant market potential. However, we have concluded that substantial concerns exist regarding organizational culture and leadership alignment. Several Sinclair executives exchanged anxious looks. Marcus paused briefly. Therefore, Hawthorne Capital will not proceed with the proposed investment at this time. The announcement struck the room like a thunderbolt. Margaret stared in disbelief. $200 million had vanished in a single sentence. One Sinclair board member immediately protested. Surely this decision can be reconsidered. Marcus responded professionally. Our decision reflects long-term strategic priorities. We remain open to future discussions if meaningful cultural improvements occur. Margaret said nothing. She already understood what everyone else in the room was beginning to realize. The company had not lost the investment because of one conversation on an airplane. It had lost the investment because that conversation revealed a deeper problem that could no longer be ignored. The meeting ended shortly afterward, but for Margaret, the consequences were only beginning. As Sinclair executives slowly gathered their materials, the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. Only hours earlier, they had entered the Grand Meridian Hotel expecting to celebrate the largest investment agreement in company history. Now they were leaving in stunned silence. Margaret remained seated long after everyone else had stood. Her chief financial officer approached cautiously. What do we tell the board? He asked quietly. Margaret looked exhausted. We tell them the truth, she replied. The deal is gone. Within minutes, emergency calls began pouring in. Several Sinclair board members demanded an immediate crisis meeting. Major shareholders wanted explanations. 2 regional vice presidents sent messages expressing concern about the growing public backlash. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, Sinclair Retail stock price had already fallen nearly 12% as investors reacted to reports that Hawthorne Capital had withdrawn from negotiations. In the hotel lobby, television screens displayed financial news coverage. One network featured footage from the airplane video alongside headlines discussing leadership culture and corporate accountability. Margaret watched in disbelief as commentators questioned whether Sinclair's internal culture reflected the behavior seen on the flight. Then came the second wave. Former employees began posting their own experiences online. Some described feeling ignored or undervalued. Others criticized the company's demanding culture. While many comments remained balanced and professional, together they created a narrative that Sinclair's leadership had failed to prioritize respect and inclusion. Margaret's public relations team urgently recommended a press conference and formal apology. Back at company headquarters, an emergency board meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock that evening by video conference. As soon as the meeting began, the questions started. "How did this happen?" one director asked. "Why were we unaware of these cultural concerns?" demanded another. "How much additional financial damage should we expect?" Margaret answered as honestly as she could, but for the first time in her career, she could sense the board's confidence slipping away. Finally, the chairman of the board spoke. "Margaret, regardless of intent, public perception now associates your behavior with Sinclair Retail. We must act quickly to restore trust." Several directors agreed. One suggested appointing an independent consulting firm to review company culture. Another proposed leadership training initiatives. Then came the question Margaret feared most. Should the company consider a leadership transition? The room fell silent. No one answered immediately, but the fact that the question had been asked at all felt devastating. After the meeting ended, Margaret sat alone in her office overlooking the city skyline. Her phone buzzed once more. This time it was an email from Marcus Johnson. Expecting criticism, she opened it reluctantly. Instead, she found only a brief message. "Ms. Sinclair, difficult moments can become turning points if we choose to learn from them. I sincerely hope both you and Sinclair Retail emerge stronger from this experience. Respectfully, Marcus Johnson." Margaret read the message twice. Marcus had every reason to humiliate her publicly. He had chosen compassion instead. Sitting alone in the darkening office, Margaret finally understood that losing the investment was not the greatest loss she had suffered that day. The greatest loss had been something far more important: the trust and respect she had once taken for granted. The following morning, Margaret arrived at Sinclair Retail headquarters before sunrise, hoping for a few quiet moments to think before facing another difficult day. Instead, she found several news vans already parked outside the building. Reporters stood near the entrance discussing the growing controversy, and social media continued to amplify every new development. Overnight, Sinclair Retail stock had fallen another 8%. More troubling, 3 major institutional investors had requested emergency meetings with the board. Inside the executive offices, the atmosphere was tense. Employees who normally greeted Margaret warmly now offered polite but distant nods. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others seemed uncertain about what to say. Margaret could not blame them. For years, she had focused almost exclusively on performance metrics, quarterly reports, and expansion targets. She had rarely considered how employees actually experienced the culture she had created. At 9 o'clock, the board convened another emergency session. This time, the discussion was direct. The chairman began. "Margaret, the board recognizes your contributions over the past decade. However, we must restore confidence among investors, employees, and customers." Another director added, "We believe immediate changes are necessary." The board unanimously approved an independent review of company culture, leadership practices, and employee relations. Then came the recommendation Margaret had anticipated but still dreaded. The chairman spoke carefully. "Margaret, we believe it would be in the company's best interest for you to take a temporary leave of absence while the review is conducted." Margaret sat silently. She had dedicated 15 years of her life to building Sinclair Retail. Hearing those words felt almost unreal. Yet deep down, she knew the board was right. "I understand," she said quietly. News of her leave spread within minutes. Financial analysts described the decision as necessary. Investors responded positively, and the company's stock stabilized for the first time since the crisis began. Later that afternoon, Margaret returned home earlier than she had in years. For the first time in decades, she had nowhere to be, no meeting to attend, and no decisions to make. The silence inside her house felt overwhelming. As she sat alone in her living room, she noticed something unusual. On a side table lay several unopened birthday cards from employees, former colleagues, and community organizations. Many had arrived months earlier. She had been too busy to read them. One card from a longtime store manager caught her attention. Inside, the manager had written, "I hope someday our company becomes as focused on people as it is on profits." Margaret read the sentence repeatedly. That evening, she made an unexpected decision. She instructed her assistant to schedule meetings not with investors or consultants, but with current and former employees from every level of the organization. She wanted to listen, truly listen. The process would be uncomfortable. It would require humility, honesty, and change. But for the first time, Margaret realized that losing her position might not be the end of her story. It might be the beginning of becoming the leader she should have been all along. Over the next several weeks, Margaret kept the promise she had made to herself. She met with store associates, warehouse employees, regional managers, and even former staff members who had left Sinclair Retail years earlier. Some conversations were encouraging. Others were painfully honest. One employee described feeling invisible despite working for the company for more than a decade. Another explained that many workers were afraid to share concerns because they believed leadership only cared about numbers. A former manager admitted that he had resigned after repeatedly watching talented employees leave because they felt unappreciated. Margaret listened without defending herself. For perhaps the first time in her professional life, she stopped trying to explain and simply listened. The experience changed her. One afternoon, nearly 2 months after the flight, Margaret received an unexpected invitation. Hawthorne Capital was hosting the opening ceremony for a new community learning center in Dallas. Attached to the invitation was a handwritten note from Sophie. "I hope you can come. I would like to show you my favorite classroom." Margaret read the note several times. She was surprised, especially after everything that had happened. Nevertheless, she accepted. When she arrived at the learning center, she immediately recognized many of the colorful designs from Sophie's sketchbook. Children filled the building, exploring science stations, reading corners, and art studios. Laughter echoed throughout the center. Sophie spotted Margaret almost immediately and ran over enthusiastically. "You came," she said with a smile. "Thank you for inviting me," Margaret replied sincerely. Sophie proudly gave Margaret a tour of the facility, explaining how different spaces had been designed to help children learn and feel welcome. As they walked, Margaret noticed Marcus speaking with educators and local families. Eventually, their paths crossed. Marcus greeted her warmly. "Ms. Sinclair, it is good to see you again." Margaret smiled nervously. "Please call me Margaret." They walked together through the center for several minutes. Finally, Margaret stopped. "Marcus, I know I apologized before, but I want to apologize again. Not because of the business consequences, but because I genuinely regret how I treated you and Sophie. I have spent a great deal of time reflecting, and I realize now that my assumptions revealed flaws in me that I had ignored for far too long." Marcus listened quietly. After a moment, he nodded. "Growth often begins with uncomfortable truth," he said. "What matters is what we do afterward." Margaret looked around at the children filling the center. "I am trying to do better." Marcus smiled. "I know. People from your company have told me about the changes you have been making." Margaret looked surprised. "You have been following what is happening at Sinclair?" Marcus nodded. "Change deserves encouragement." For the first time since that flight, Margaret felt something she had not experienced in months. Hope. 6 months later, Sinclair Retail looked very different. The independent review had resulted in sweeping changes throughout the organization. Employee feedback systems had been expanded, leadership training had become mandatory for every executive, and new community partnership programs had been launched across the country. More importantly, the culture inside the company had begun to change. Employees reported feeling heard, respected, and valued in ways many had never experienced before. Margaret had never returned to her former position as Chief Executive Officer. Instead, after much reflection, she chose to step into a new role focused entirely on organizational culture and community engagement. Many people were surprised by her decision. Margaret was not. For years, She had chased growth, status, and recognition, believing those things defined success. Now she understood that leadership meant something entirely different. One autumn afternoon, Margaret stood inside a newly renovated Sinclair Community Learning Center located in Chicago. Children filled the classrooms, reading, creating art, and participating in after-school programs. On one wall hung a framed message chosen by employees from across the company. Respect is not earned by status. It is demonstrated through action. As Margaret reviewed the center with local staff, she noticed two familiar visitors entering the building. Marcus and Sophie had arrived to tour the facility as part of Hawthorne Capital's ongoing educational initiative. Sophie immediately ran toward Margaret with a smile. "You have to see the new art room," she said excitedly. Margaret laughed. "Lead the way." Together, they walked through classrooms filled with students whose lives would be changed by opportunities that had not existed only a year earlier. Later that afternoon, as the event concluded, Marcus and Margaret stood near the entrance watching families leave. "You have accomplished a great deal," Marcus said. Margaret shook her head gently. "We accomplished it. A year ago, I would have taken all the credit. Now I understand that meaningful change always involves other people." Marcus smiled. "That is true." Margaret looked thoughtfully across the center. "You know, losing that investment felt like losing everything at the time." Marcus nodded. "I remember." Margaret smiled softly. "Now I realize that I did not lose everything. I lost an illusion. I believed success excused arrogance and that titles determined someone's worth. Losing those beliefs may have been the best thing that ever happened to me." Marcus extended his hand once more, just as he had on the airplane many months earlier. This time, Margaret accepted it immediately. As they shook hands, Sophie looked up and smiled. "Dad always says that people can change." Margaret looked at Sophie. "Your father is right." As the sun began to set outside the center windows, Margaret watched families walking to their cars, children laughing beside them. For the first time in many years, she felt something far more valuable than professional success. She felt peace. Because in the end, the most important lesson she learned was simple. Every person deserves dignity long before you discover who they are, because character is revealed not by how we treat important people, but by how we treat everyone.